Hi everyone, Knock the Off Dano here, the internet's second busiest music nerd, and it's time for a review of the new Joji album, Nectar. Sophomore effort of meme lord gone singer-songwriter R&B pop superstar Joji, aka George Miller. Probably the biggest name on the 88 Rising label, and by that I mean the only reason that they're relevant. Extremely hyped up over the last year, for God knows why, Joji is back, and not sounding like his usual self. Sadly, it seems like with each iteration of Joji's catalog, he loses a bit of his sound. While most people write off his initial EP as rudimentary and underwhelming, I found In Tongues to be very enjoyable overall. With a sonic focus on nostalgia, aided by the constant clattering of chains that are heard throughout the EP. It's very much Joji's original sound. Some of this was lost on his debut album Ballads 1, which didn't have much focus and had a lot of variety to it. In my opinion, Joji's best tracks on that album, and in general, are the ones that he produces himself. He has a very unique sound, and I think they need to showcase that more often. Which is a perfect segue into my thoughts on Nectar. Produced mostly by the same guys that helped Rich Brian make The Sailor, this album is very formulaic sounding. Having heard the direction that The Sailor went, I was worried that Nectar would do the same thing, and that 88 would try to push this new, very string-based sound onto Joji. I have nothing against strings. I was just worried that the two albums would sound too similar. And lo and behold, I was right! I was starting to get whiffs of these similarities with the singles that came out for this album. Tracks like Sanctuary, Gimme Love, Run, Daylight, most of which I like. And sadly, are the best songs on the album for the most part. So you can bet your ass I was worried going into this album for the first time. I think first impressions are key, and the opener does a perfect job setting the tone for this album, which is boring. Ew starts out with these pillowy keys and this wall of strings. Then suddenly, at the snap of Joji's fingers, it turns into the most generic intro you've ever heard. On lots of instances on this album, Joji likes to hit these really high notes. Sadly, he's still not great at vocals, and so he usually relies on auto-tune to help him, reach those notes he can't quite get. However, especially on this album, that usually creates this really tinny sound. This is especially noticeable on this song and Run. The second song also starts with twinkly keys, but this one has a better vocal flow. I will say that his ad-libs are a little bit annoying. It's almost as if he's interrupting himself. That's just more distracting than anything. I will say I did like TOCK. I thought it was interesting. Starts out with these really low, deep vocals like kind of a classic Joji song would, and it has some fun vocal layering. However, it ends before it can really build or evolve, and ends up not really being that interesting. Also, the guitars on it feel not off-key, but just like they could have used a more interesting chord progression, or at least changed it up. It feels a bit repetitive. I will say I did like Daylight. The guitars on there sound like the Pornhub intro, but Diplo actually did a good job with this, especially during the chorus, when this wall of synths just hits you. I don't know what Upgrade is supposed to be. It's about a minute long and it's boring as fuck. I think they were attempting for like an interlude, but this album completely lacks song-to-song flow. Whereas the first half of Ballads felt very cohesive, there are almost no instances of that on Nectar. It just feels like a collection of songs. And boring ones at that. Run is cheesy as hell. I never liked Run. The guitar solo at the end just makes me roll my eyes. This just sounds like a bunch of white guys produced it and were like, here, just sing over this, it's cool. The kids will like it. It shreds. It's shredded. Now we get to Pretty Boy, which if you ask me is probably the most controversial song on the whole album. The snippet of this song that was originally released is probably one of my favorite Joji tracks ever, period. Then they decided to flip it over and the Lil Yachty feature isn't as terrible as I initially thought it was going to be when they announced the track listing for this album, but it's terribly unnecessary. I would have been totally fine with the original first minute of this and nothing else. The mixing for the mid-section is a little bit weird too. It leans too heavily with all of the sounds being in one ear and all of the rest being in the other. I feel like George Martin mixed this song. I do like the part where he goes, "Suck my nuts!" That's kind of funny. Normal People is boring, which is especially funny considering the lyric where he goes, "We can pretend we're boring people." You don't have to pretend. You're being boring. Ray Brown is another example of a useless feature that doesn't really add anything to the song, which is especially sad considering the duo's past work together. Once in a While is fantastic, but this song fails to capture any of the magic that that song had. Afterthought is probably the only good example of a feature. Benny or Benet? Beignet? What? Feels like she actually belongs on that track. She and Joji complement each other pretty well. Mr. Hollywood is just a cheesy R&B ballad. The only word I could use to describe it is cliche. I said, Mr. Hollywood, would you come back home? Next, the worst song on the entire album has to be 777. This song is just all over the place. I don't even know where to start. It sounds like Joji's attempt at making a weekend song, but then the drop comes in out of nowhere and is completely underwhelming. It feels like they had totally two different ideas and they just smashed them together. Work! This'll work! And the auto-tune on this song is especially horrendous. The penultimate track is pretty for the most part, but feels lackluster compared to similar songs like Slow Dancing. I don't even like Slow Dancing that much to begin with, so this track didn't do that much for me. And the closer, You're a Man, is alright. Doesn't feel much like a closer. Like I said earlier, there's not really much flow to this album. You could have placed it anywhere else. I do like the Daft Punk-esque outro though. Overall, this album just feels like 88 Rising's attempt to push Joji further into the mainstream and sacrificing what made him special to achieve that. You'd figure an album this long would have more variety to it, but it really doesn't. You could tell visually from this album, without even having heard it, that this shit was gonna be boring. Just look at this god-awful merch. Who designed that? Pink Eye could design better merch in MS Paint even if I broke all of his fingers. Who is this guy? I don't even... Looks kinda ugly. My goal is to get blocked by 88 Rising on all platforms. I'll keep you guys updated on that. Hashtag fuck 88 Rising. Anyways, I'm feeling a strong 3 to a life 4 on this thing. Transgender. Did you give this album a listen? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What would you rate it? Fuck all of you. I fucking hate you so much. God, fuck.